Hey everyone, tonight we begin with the silk, sweat, and subtle power games of a concubine in feudal Japan. Imagine being trained your entire life to master the fine art of walking, sighing, and seducing a daimyo with the exact angle of your wrist. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Dawn arrives with all the subtlety of a polite knock. No roosters, no fanfare, just the faint glow through rice paper doors and the soft shuffle of servants pretending they aren't judging your futon posture. You lie perfectly still, not because you're rested, but because any abrupt movement might undo your status as graceful and mysterious. In truth, your back hurts, your hair is flattened on one side, and you've had a dream involving eels you'd rather not analyze. But none of that matters now. This is the first scene of the day's performance. You are the star and also the stage decoration. Your attendants enter in hushed tones, bowing so low you briefly consider stepping over them. A warm basin is set before you, as if to say, "Here's your dignity, now scrub behind your ears." They begin their work, cleansing, brushing, preparing you to look less like someone who just woke up and more like a porcelain enigma. Your face is washed gently, your hair brushed with reverence, not because they love you, but because they've seen what happens to court women who show up with frizz. Meanwhile, you maintain the correct expression, serene, detached, and only mildly annoyed. Still silent, because heaven forbid a concubine speak before being powdered. You glance at your reflection in a polished bronze mirror. You look like someone who has opinions but is paid not to share them. Perfect. From beyond the sliding screen comes the muffled laughter of the daimyo, who apparently has energy this morning. That's either a promising sign or a warning. You make a mental note to avoid direct eye contact with his favorite concubine until after tea. You rise from the futon like a swan emerging from fog, assuming the swan has slightly numb legs and a tight obi waiting in her near future. Your sleeves are laid out, the incense is lit, the illusion begins, and as you stretch your shoulders just slightly, you whisper the universal mantra of women everywhere, "Here we go again." Now that you're upright and pretending you didn't sleep on your neck wrong, it's time for makeup, or as it's known in the concubine industry, historical self-erasure with a side of toxins. Step 1. The white powder, made from crushed rice and in some cases, enough lead to qualify as a building material. Your attendant starts patting it onto your face like she's trying to cover up a crime scene. The goal: eliminate all signs of life. If your skin tone resembles anything found in nature, you're doing it wrong. Next comes the neck and chest, because heaven forbid the daimyo glimpses a patch of skin that doesn't look like it was painted on by a ghost. You sit still while they go to town with the puff, occasionally resisting the urge to sneeze and ruin your new identity. Then the eyebrows. Yours? Irrelevant. They're painted over and redrawn several centimeters too high, creating a look that says, "I'm surprised by everything and emotionally unavailable." It's considered alluring, in theory. Now the lips. You'd think they'd be fully painted, but no, just a dainty little red blob in the middle. It's supposed to look demure. Instead, it looks like you kissed a plum and ran away. But you nod approvingly anyway, because this is how tradition works. If it feels strange and mildly unflattering, you're probably doing it right. And finally, the pièce de résistance, teeth blackening. Yes, really, a sticky iron paste is carefully brushed onto your teeth, making your smile look like it's been censored. Supposedly, this signals that you're off limits. In practice, it only confuses people and gives you one more reason not to grin too often. Throughout this whole ordeal, you sit like a statue being vandalized by a very polite team of artists. You do not move, you do not comment, you certainly do not ask, "Is this really necessary?" The answer is always yes, not because it makes sense, but because it's been done this way for centuries, and no one wants to be the first to blink. By the end, you look like a painting come to life, if the painting was done by someone who hated skin and liked drama. After being powdered into an emotionally distant kabuki mask, it's time to get dressed. And by dressed, we don't mean slipping into something comfortable. We mean willingly entering a fabric-based endurance challenge. Step 1. Underlayers. These are the breathable cotton pieces meant to stop your fancier garments from fusing with your soul during summer. They do not succeed, but at least they give you the illusion of ventilation. Next come the inner robes, decorative, symbolic, and entirely unnecessary, except that they're absolutely required. Each one must be put on in the right order, or your social status drops faster than a clumsy geisha on ice. Color combinations are entirely coded. For example, dark red over pale green means elegant but mysterious, while white over gold says, "Please don't talk to me before tea." Then there's the outer kimono, heavier, shinier, much less forgiving. By now your sleeves are long enough to smother a rival concubine if needed, which incidentally is why no one stands too close during morning prep. And finally, the obi, the sash that ties it all together and quietly tries to murder your spine. It's pulled tight enough to remind you you're not allowed to breathe freely until sunset. A well-tied obi can say many things: refinement, poise, and the quiet desperation of someone one sneeze away from full collapse. You don't dress yourself, of course. You stand still while two attendants wrap, fold, tug, and adjust you like they're trying to make origami out of a human being. They don't speak. They just occasionally grunt when something doesn't lie flat. That grunt means hold your arms higher. You learn the language. By the time they're done, you've lost all feeling in your ribs, but you look magnificent, like a walking imperial scroll with passive-aggressive eyes. And the real kicker, this is your daily outfit. You don't even have plans. You might just sit in the garden pretending to read poetry all day, but you must look like you're ready for a royal portrait or a spontaneous seduction, which, to be fair, is not off the table. You're fully dressed now, which is impressive considering you're wearing more fabric than a small pavilion tent. Time for breakfast, or as it's known in concubine circles, an exercise in restraint, posture, and not accidentally dipping your sleeve in the miso. You're seated on a cushion, legs tucked properly beneath you, which is charming if you're a folding fan, but a nightmare if you have knees. A tray is placed in front of you, precisely arranged. A bowl of rice, a sliver of grilled fish, 3 pickled vegetables, and a miso soup that looks like it's judging you. The portions are small because you are not here to bulk up. You are here to appear ethereal and faintly underfed, the way all good romantic metaphors do. Your job is to consume just enough to avoid collapsing, but not enough to imply you enjoy food. If you chew too enthusiastically, someone will raise an eyebrow. If you ask for seconds, someone will raise a scroll. Eating is done silently, no slurping, no sighing, and definitely no face contortions, even if the pickled plum just sucker punched your taste buds. Everything must be graceful, a ballet of chopsticks and disappointment. Your kimono sleeves are enormous, so each bite and level of spatial awareness usually reserved for swordplay. You develop techniques, tuck the sleeve under your forearm, lean slightly sideways, pray it doesn't drag through the soup, and send a wave of fermented tofu across the tatami. All the while, attendants hover quietly. They won't say anything, but they're watching, not in a creepy way, more in the "we'll gossip about this later" way. Every blink is noted, every missed grain of rice is mentally cataloged under mild embarrassment. You finish, bow lightly, and set your chopsticks down with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. Breakfast complete. Was it satisfying? Emotionally, no. Nutritionally, questionable. But spiritually, you feel lighter. That could be the food or the fact that your obi is slowly cutting off circulation to your spine. Either way, you're ready for the next part of your day, which, spoiler alert, mostly involves waiting. Now that you've been powdered, robed, and fed something roughly the size of a toddler's snack, it's time for the concubine's primary daily task: waiting. But not just any waiting, elegant waiting. Waiting that whispers, "Yes, I'm entirely free this afternoon," but in a powerful way. You can't roam the estate freely, heavens no. That's how scandals happen. Instead, you sit in your designated space. A tastefully minimal garden room with a painted screen, a bonsai tree, and a strategically placed view of a koi pond that hasn't done anything interesting since last autumn. You sit, you wait. Occasionally, you adjust your posture so it looks like you're contemplating eternity, not fighting off a leg cramp. You're not allowed to look impatient. That's for merchants and wives. Concubines wait like they're doing you a favor. This wait could last 10 minutes or 5 hours. The daimyo may summon you or not. He might be with another woman, or reading war poetry, or just napping with his head on a very expensive pillow. The point is, you'll find out when someone tells you or doesn't. To pass the time, you might compose a poem, not a good one, just something vaguely sad about plum blossoms and unspoken longing. That's the genre. Bonus points if no one can tell who it's actually about. You could also play a shamisen softly, not too joyful. No one likes a concubine who seems excited. Of course, the other women are waiting too, sometimes within sight, sometimes just out of earshot. It's a silent competition. Who looks most serene? Who adjusted her robe just right? Who caught the eye of the messenger delivering tea to the daimyo's quarters? It's chess played with glances, posture, and whether or not your obi is tied fashionably off-center. And the trickiest part? Looking like you're not waiting at all. You must appear as though your entire sense of self-worth doesn't hang on the possibility of being summoned tonight, which of course it absolutely does. But you're a professional. You sigh quietly, beautifully, and look off into the distance, preferably towards something poetic like a falling leaf or a koi that looks equally bored. If the morning was about preparation, the afternoon is about positioning. And we're not talking about yoga. This is courtly social strategy, dressed in floral silk and scented with plum blossom oil. By now, the other concubines are fully assembled. You exchange nods, shallow bows, and smiles that look warm but could cut glass. This isn't friendship, it's veiled espionage. Everyone's watching, listening, and very quietly trying to destroy each other's reputations without ever raising their voices. The room is calm, the tension is floral, the topics of conversation are trivial by design. Lady Aiko's calligraphy has improved. Translation: she used to write like a drunken monk. The daimyo seemed very peaceful this morning. Translation: he didn't summon you, did he? And of course the classic, you look radiant today, which actually means you look less dead than usual. Congratulations. Compliments are verbal daggers sheathed in politeness. The sharper the smile, the more likely you're being insulted. A well-timed observation about someone's kimono being bravely modern can spark a week-long existential crisis. You navigate all of this with grace, or at least you pretend to. Smile gently, tilt your head when listening, appear impressed by someone's haiku even though it was clearly plagiarized from a folding screen. Then comes the moment someone mentions the daimyo. Maybe he was seen walking near the pond. Maybe he paused to examine a fan one of the other concubines left out by accident. The room becomes still, but casually still, like no one's definitely panicking on the inside. This is when the performance deepens. You must seem interested in him, but not too interested. Confident, but not cocky. Available, but untouched. It's like trying to be a dessert that everyone wants, but no one's sure is safe to eat. And through it all, you keep your voice soft, your posture impeccable, and your insults indirect. This is how status is gained. Not through war, but through whispers. And if you leave the room with even one rival doubting her sleeve choice, her poem, or her scent, you've done well today. You haven't been summoned yet, but hope springs eternal, and also sweats discreetly under 12 layers of silk. So as the sun crawls past its highest point, and you've survived another round of eye contact diplomacy, it's time for your just-in-case bath. Not mandatory, just highly recommended. In the same way it's recommended you don't smell like anxiety and pickled radish when entering a daimyo's private chamber. The bathhouse is quiet, steamy, and filled with the faint scent of yuzu peels and pressure. You undress with your attendant's help, because most concubines cannot single-handedly escape the labyrinth of ties, folds, knots, and moral restrictions that come with formal kimono wear. Once disrobed, finally free of the human upholstery, you step into the hot water. For a brief moment, you are no one. Not a symbol, not a strategy, just a sweaty woman in a tub wondering if she shaved her legs evenly enough for an aristocrat with questionable eyesight. You scrub, but not aggressively. There's a technique to this. You want to be clean, not desperate. A light scent is applied, nothing too floral. You're not trying to smell like a geisha with something to prove, just alluring enough to imply you own your own fan. Hair is re-oiled, skin is dusted, Feet are checked for calluses because yes, even your heels must be ready for inspection by men who haven't clipped their toenails since the last rice harvest. And all this might be for nothing. You may not be called. You may go back to your quarters and reapply all your powder just to sit perfectly still while composing emotionally vague poetry about ducks. But if he does summon you and you show up smelling like stress and raw tofu, scandalous. So you bathe, you prepare, you become soft and subtle and ever so mildly flammable with incense oil. Because being ready is part of the game, even if the invitation never arrives. And besides, the best revenge on the other concubines? Looking better than they do while not even trying. It doesn't happen with trumpets. There's no scroll unrolled by a herald, no dramatic gong. The summons, when it finally comes, arrives the way most terrifying things do in high society, politely. A soft knock, a bowed messenger, a single phrase, his lordship requests your presence. Translation, you've been chosen. Also, you have 20 minutes to mentally prepare, repowder, and spiritually detach. Your attendants spring into action. You, meanwhile, attempt to look neither smug nor nauseous. After all, this is a compliment, possibly. It could mean he favors you, or it could mean his favorite is annoyed with him and you're the understudy. Either way, tonight you're on stage. First comes reapplication, a fresh layer of powder to mask the existential dread, a tiny touch of rouge to say, alive but mysterious, and a careful adjustment of your outer kimono. You switch to the more expensive one, the one with cranes embroidered in flight, because nothing says, I'm worth undressing slowly, like symbolic birds in gold thread. Next, the hair already perfect, but you go over it again, just in case. You add a comb, not too flashy, and dab a little extra yuzu oil behind the ears. You smell like restraint and citrus ambition. As you walk toward his private chambers, the hallway stretches endlessly. Every step is measured, not too fast, not too eager. You are a river, not a waterfall. Behind closed doors, rival concubines pretend not to notice, but they do. Oh, they do. You reach the inner room. A screen is slid open. You bow deeply, elegantly. You're not nervous, just incredibly aware of every inch of your body and whether or not your lips are smudged. He greets you, or doesn't. Either way, you smile faintly. You're now in character. A favorite, a diversion, a muse for the evening. No one says that's not how this works. You are here because you were chosen, and for the next few hours you must be art, warmth, mystery, and convenience. And maybe, just maybe, unforgettable. But let's not get cocky yet. There's still tea to pour. Despite what the gossiping ladies might say, a concubine's evening with the daimyo doesn't start with disrobing. It starts with ritual, specifically a slow, fragrant descent into flirtation so formal it might be mistaken for a tea ceremony with unresolved tension. You sit, not too close, not yet. There's a lacquered table between you, a pot of psych warming silently, and enough eye contact to fuel an entire haiku anthology. He pours you a cup, that's the cue. You sip it slowly, like it's not just fermented rice, but a coded invitation to be charming. Compliments begin both ways. His robe, magnificent. Your hair, exquisite. No one mentions that you both know exactly how this night ends, but it's part of the charm to pretend otherwise. Conversation drifts. Poetry, dreams, sometimes a story about a hawk he once saw that looked like destiny. You nod, intrigued, and not just because his hand is inching closer. You've heard the hawk story 3 times, but that's not the point. The point is, tonight you're the muse, even if you're also the well-trained performer. There might be music, maybe a soft melody on the shamisen, not played by you, of course. You're busy holding the room's attention like a delicate fan, open, mysterious, and possibly sharp-edged. Now comes the touch, light at first, measured. He's testing the waters, or perhaps reminding himself which concubine you are. You respond accordingly, just enough to signal interest, never so much as to appear enthusiastic. Remember, mystery is sexy, desperation is not. There's no conversation that ended with the poetry. This is about presence. You're both in character now. He, the powerful lord. You, the willing flower who conveniently just bloomed tonight. You move the way you were taught, gracefully, precisely, as if choreographed by someone who's never actually been in love but read a lot of poetry about it. You make all the right sounds at all the right times. Not too loud, not too silent, just enough to let him know he's doing well, even if you're mentally reorganizing your poetry scrolls. Eventually it ends, either in triumph or in what you will later refer to as a gentle fade out. He may say something, he may not. You smile either way. You rise, redress, and bow carefully, hiding the pins that left indentations in your scalp and the cramp that started somewhere in Act 2, and then you leave. You do not look back. You do not ask how it was. You do not ask if he remembers your name, because this was not for connection, this was for position. And tonight, you had it. For now, he's asleep, sprawled out across the futon, like a man who's just conquered a province, and not, say, fallen asleep immediately after moderate effort. You lie beside him, eyes open, spine straight, mind racing. Not because you're overwhelmed with emotion, but because this part, the afterglow, is where the real mental gymnastics begin. Did you do well? Was your hair still in place? Did he like the part where you tilted your head just so? Should you have moaned a bit more, or was that one breath too loud? These are the questions you won't ask, but will obsessively review, like a general analyzing battlefield losses. You can't move yet. Leaving too soon seems cold. Staying too long seems clingy. So you lie there, watching the ceiling, counting the bamboo slats, and wondering if the other concubines are awake. Probably. They can smell a summoning like wolves smell fear. The silence is heavy, not unpleasant, just full of unsaid things, unasked questions, and the faint hope that you've earned yourself a slightly better breakfast tray tomorrow. He might mumble something, a compliment, a name, hopefully yours. You nod in the dark, even if he's already snoring like a man who's never had to sleep with his dignity folded inside his obi. Eventually you rise quietly. The graceful post-coital exit is a delicate thing. You gather your robe, tie your sash, and straighten your hair just enough to look like a woman who glows from mystery, not sweat. There's no one in the corridor, but you walk like they're all watching, because in this place, they always are. Your footsteps are soft, your face is neutral, your heart tucked away, locked up behind your very best performance yet. You return to your quarters. Someone has already lit the lamp. The tea is warm. You drink it without tasting it. You sit down alone, and only then do you exhale. You don't know if tonight meant anything. You don't know if he'll remember it, or you, tomorrow. But at the very least, you know this. You were chosen. And in this world, that is currency, even if it only lasts until sunrise. You wake up early again, not because you're refreshed, but because concubines don't get to sleep in. That's for wives, or men, or mythical creatures with no political rivals. The futon you fell into last night feels smaller, or maybe you're just aware of how little space you actually occupy in the palace's hierarchy, a decorative presence wrapped in brocade and tightly controlled expectations. Your attendants enter, eyes politely avoiding yours. No one says anything about where you were last night, but they all know. The scent of incense lingers faintly on your skin, and your hair is only slightly messier than the standard unapproachable cloud of perfection. They begin the process anew. Powder, comb, fold, reconstruct the masterpiece that is your public face, which is remarkably similar to yesterday's masterpiece, with the only real difference being your increased awareness of how exhausting beauty actually is. The silence between you and your attendants is companionable, if also tinged with quiet judgment. One might cough ever so slightly. Another might casually mention that Lady Ko received a rare silk comb this morning. You nod. The game is back on. There's no debrief, no recap. You don't tell anyone how the daimyo smelled faintly of plum wine, or how he said something vaguely poetic before falling asleep mid-sentence. You certainly don't mention that you're now second-guessing every moment of eye contact. That would be unseemly. Instead, you sit once again in your chamber, composed, refined, preparing for another day of passive warfare, disguised as floral arrangement critiques and shamisen practice. You sip tea, you write half a poem, you stare at a crane outside the window and wonder what it feels like to fly away from all of this while wearing only one layer of clothing. By now, news will have traveled. Everyone knows you were summoned. Everyone is recalculating, including you, because that's what being a concubine really means. Balancing emotion with calculation, intimacy with strategy, and desire with absolute silence. You smooth your sleeve. You breathe. Today you are not the favorite, but you are still in the game. And in this palace, survival looks an awful lot like stillness in silk. You don't need ears to hear gossip in a palace. You just need functioning intuition and a decent understanding of passive-aggressive phrasing. Within an hour of sunrise, your name has floated through at least 3 courtyards, 2 tea rooms, and a suspiciously loud flower arranging session. No one says it directly, of course. They say things like how radiant Lady So-and-so seems this morning, which means she's glowing because she got chosen and we're all pretending not to notice. Or, I wonder if his lordship prefers traditional poetry or livelier company these days. Translation, she probably recited something dumb and still got picked. Unbelievable. You hear these things in passing snippets, whispered behind fans or dropped into casual conversations like little poison seeds. It's impressive in a way, like watching trained assassins throw shade with floral metaphors. Your job? Stay quiet, say nothing, smile faintly, the way a cat does when it knows something you don't. Because engaging in gossip is risky, but being the target of gossip and reacting, fatal. So instead you vanish a little. You take longer walks. You sit slightly further from the group. You practice your calligraphy with such focus that people begin to wonder if you're either deeply enlightened or quietly scheming. Either way, good, because in the concubine arena, invisibility is a superpower. The loud ones get noticed, the noticed ones get envied, and envy here is basically a decorative dagger in a silk sheath. You respond to barbed compliments with kindness so polite it's insulting. Oh, you think my robe is too elaborate? Thank you. It was a gift. Smile, bow, exit the scene. You survive on restraint, timing, and the occasional knowing glance that suggests you could destroy someone if you cared enough. And while others scramble for proximity to power, you perfect the art of subtle distance. You don't need to always be in the spotlight, because you were already in it once. It starts subtly, fewer glances, slower summons. One day the maid forgets your favorite incense. Another, your tea arrives lukewarm. The message is clear, not harsh, not cruel, just indifferent. You are no longer tonight's mystery. Someone else is. She's new or not. Maybe she's just had a glow-up and a conveniently timed poem. Either way, she's suddenly the focus. The fan of attention has turned, and it's not pointing at you. You handle it like a professional. No complaints, no dramatics, just a slightly longer pause before bowing to the daimyo and an almost imperceptible tightness in your smile when someone says, "Isn't it lovely how youthful Lady Hana looks these days?" Of course it is. Youth is so charming, so temporary. Now comes the test. Can you stay poised while being quietly replaced? Can you fold your hands and compliment your successor's hairpin while mentally calculating how long she'll last before she trips over her own ambition? This is the unspoken part of the job. Not just being chosen, but being unchosen gracefully. The fall from favor is not a scandal, just a shift in the tide. You're still in the palace, still dressed like a painting, still performing, but the spotlight has moved, and now you have to survive in the shadows without looking like you care. You still show up to the garden, still compose poems, still sit perfectly still during afternoon tea while everyone tries to read into the way your cup trembles. But the truth is, you do care. Of course you do. Not just for him, but for the position, the validation, the tiny power that came with being the center of a very controlled universe. And now you are a supporting character in someone else's story. But you're still here, still powdered, still composed, still waiting, because in a palace like this, everything shifts eventually. Fortunes, fashions, favorites, all it takes is a wrong word, a broken fan, or a poetic metaphor about rain that sounds a little too personal. So you wait, not bitter, just patient, because if favor can fade, it can also return, and you'll be ready when it does. Eventually, the paint comes off. Not just the white rice powder you wear like armor, but the performance, the posture, the careful pauses between each word. At some point, whether it's years later or just a moment in solitude, you catch a glimpse of yourself without the costume. And the strange thing is, you're still there. Beneath the layers of fabric, reputation, jealousy, poems, and politeness lives a woman who remembers everything. The first summons, the first compliment, the first time she realized she was no longer the favorite. You've played every part, muse, rival, mystery, shadow. You've smiled through rejection and composed haikus while quietly planning your emotional survival. And what do you have to show for it? A spine stronger than your obi, a memory sharper than any court gossip, and an entire palace of women who either fear you, envy you, or quietly hope they age half as well as you have. Because here's the secret no one talks about. Concubines age. They fade, but they also endure. And in a world built around staying desirable, endurance is the most rebellious act of all. You no longer rush to the mirror when the messenger arrives. You no longer wonder if your hair is pinned at the right angle for seduction. Some days you skip the full makeup ritual and just sit by the koi pond, because sometimes watching fish do nothing feels more honest than trying to look like a poem. You still dress in silk, yes, but now you wear it for yourself. And when the new girls arrive, powdered, bright-eyed, walking the same hallway you once conquered, you smile, not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly, because you've played the game. You danced on the edge of power with your lips painted and your voice lowered to a whisper, and you're still here, still graceful, still dangerous in silence. What remains when the paint wears off? You do. And that's more than anyone ever expected. In ancient Babylon, the line between the sacred and the sensual wasn't just blurred, it was obliterated. The heart of this mystery lay in the towering temples of Ishtar, goddess of love, fertility, and war. Unlike the prudish morality that came centuries later, the Babylonians saw sexuality as a divine bridge, a way to reach the gods, not offend them. Within these temples, ritual sex wasn't just accepted, it was expected, and it wasn't done in shadowy corners, but in full view of heaven. According to ancient sources, particularly Herodotus, that tireless gossip of the classical world, every Babylonian woman, at least once in her life, was required to present herself at the temple of Ishtar. There, she would wait, adorned in perfume and prayer, until a stranger approached her and tossed a silver coin into her lap, the goddess's price. No woman could refuse. The act itself, sex with a man she didn't know, was not seen as scandalous but sacred, a public sacrifice of her body for the good of the cosmos. The temple was not a brothel, not in the way we understand it. It was more like a stage where religion and desire played out rituals older than kings. And the women who served there, the Naditu, weren't lowly. Many were priestesses or daughters of nobility, cloaked in silks and mystery. Their duties were spiritual, ecstatic, and yes, sexual. The idea was simple and utterly radical. By engaging in sex under the gaze of the gods, fertility was invoked, divine favor was won, and cosmic order was maintained. The land would bear crops, the rivers would flow, wombs would swell. It wasn't sin, it was sacred ecology. But let's not romanticize it entirely. Even in antiquity, not everyone agreed with this so-called sacred sex. Later Mesopotamian rulers would try to distance themselves from the practice, perhaps out of moral reform or political pressure. But for a brief golden window in Babylon's history, the body was not a vessel of shame. It was the altar, and the whispering walls of Ishtar's temple still echo with those long-forgotten moans of worship. If Babylon turned sex into sacred duty, the ancient Greeks turned it into theater, one with masks, wine, and secrets. At the center of this was Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and revelry, and nothing captured his spirit quite like the Dionysian mysteries, private initiation rites where participants sought to dissolve the boundaries between human and divine. These weren't your typical temple visits. The mysteries were held deep in groves or hidden sanctuaries, away from the public eye. Only the initiated could enter, and what happened inside was closely guarded. Outsiders speculated about wild orgies and drunken chaos, but the truth, as always, is more complex. Participants, men and women alike, prepared through fasting, music, dance, and long processions. They wore masks, animal skins, and sometimes nothing at all. The point was to shed your social identity, your ego, even your name. For a few hours, you weren't a merchant, a servant, or a noble. You were part of something primal, something older than the city walls. Sexual energy likely played a role, not as entertainment, but as a symbol of rebirth and unity. In a society where most of life was highly structured, these rites allowed for a controlled collapse of order. They promised catharsis, a temporary breakdown of barriers between man and woman, rich and poor, mortal and God. But it wasn't just a wild night in the woods. The mysteries were said to offer deep transformation. Those who returned claimed to have touched the divine, to have glimpsed something beyond reason. And indeed, many initiates described a feeling of renewal, as if the chaos had burned away their illusions. Of course, not everyone approved. Philosophers like Plato distrusted these ecstatic rituals, fearing they would lure people away from logic and discipline. But for many Greeks, the Dionysian mysteries were a necessary counterpart to their rigid public lives. They offered something that temples and politics could not: emotional truth. And that's the key. These rituals weren't about scandal, they were about transcendence. By embracing the wildness within, the Greeks believed they could access something sacred. In ancient Egypt, fertility wasn't just about crops or childbirth. It was the very lifeblood of the kingdom. And no river symbolized that better than the Nile. Each year, its floodwaters would rise, spreading rich silt and life across the land. The Egyptians saw this as a divine act, a sacred union between sky and earth, and they celebrated it with rituals that were anything but subtle. One of the most intriguing festivals was held in honor of the god Min, a deity of fertility, agriculture, and masculine vigor. His statues left little to the imagination, often shown with an exaggerated, permanent sign of virility. Min was not just a symbol of life, but of potency. At his annual festival, crowds would gather to watch the pharaoh himself participate in a ceremonial harvest, cutting the first sheaf of grain as an offering to the god. But this wasn't just a farming event. Dancers would perform nude or scantily clad, celebrating the beauty of the human body and its role in creation. Ritual chants, rhythmic drumming, and incense created an atmosphere that blurred the line between spiritual exaltation and sensory pleasure. Women played a key role in many of these ceremonies, especially during the festival of drunkenness dedicated to the goddess Hathor, patron of love, music, and joy. This wild annual celebration involved wine, music, and ecstatic dancing, meant to honor the myth in which Hathor saved the world by drinking herself into a stupor. Participants believed that by reenacting the goddess's drunken joy, they were restoring cosmic balance, bringing chaos into order. Were there sexual undertones? Almost certainly, but they weren't seen as taboo. The Egyptians didn't view sexuality through the lens of guilt or shame. For them, it was part of nature's cycle, as vital and sacred as the flooding Nile. In fact, some healing temples even included rituals where fertility problems were addressed, not just with herbs, but through symbolic acts involving touch, suggestion, or sacred role play, overseen by temple staff who acted as intermediaries between human and divine. In ancient Egypt, to embrace pleasure was not indulgence. It was alignment with the gods, and every kiss of the Nile reminded them that life at its core was a sensual gift from the divine. Rome, where even chaos had structure, and nowhere was that more evident than in Lupercalia, the annual fertility festival held each February beneath the Palatine Hill. What began as a wild rural rite in honor of shepherd gods morphed into one of the strangest public celebrations in Roman history. One part purification, one part party, and more than a little bit of provocative theater. The ritual honored Lupercus, a god associated with fertility and the protection of livestock. But the origin myth went deeper. The cave of Lupercal was said to be the very spot where Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, were suckled by a she-wolf, and that primal symbolism bled into the celebration itself. At the heart of the festivities were the Luperci, a group of young men chosen to represent wild, untamed energy. Clad in little more than goat skins, or sometimes nothing at all, they would run through the streets playfully striking women with strips of hide called februa. Far from being offended, women actively sought out the lashes. Being struck was believed to enhance fertility, ease childbirth, and even increase sensual vitality. It was messy, loud, and unapologetically earthy. There were sacrifices, feasting, and bawdy songs, but there was also a sense of sacred intention. Lupercalia marked the cleansing of the city, a symbolic brushing away of winter's stagnation to make room for spring's renewal. Sexual overtones were present, sure, but wrapped in layers of myth, nature, and destiny. Later Roman poets, including Ovid, would write about Lupercalia with a mix of humor and nostalgia. And while conservative voices tried to tame the festivities over time, the tradition held strong for centuries until Christianity eventually swept in with a stricter moral lens. Interestingly, some historians suggest that Valentine's Day may have grown from the ashes of Lupercalia, transformed from goatskin rites to paper hearts. But the root idea remained: fertility, love, and the strange human urge to ritualize desire. Rome didn't separate the physical from the sacred. It wrapped them around each other like vines on a temple column, sometimes tangled, always connected. And for one wild day each year, the people let their inner wolves run free. If Lupercalia was a public spectacle, the Eleusinian mysteries were its spiritual opposite, secretive, sacred, and solemn. Celebrated annually for over 1,000 years in ancient Greece, these rites revolved around the myth of Demeter and Persephone and offered initiates a powerful glimpse into life, death, and rebirth. But beneath the poetic myth and theatrical silence, some scholars believe the ceremonies may have included symbolic, perhaps even sensual elements, cloaked in allegory. Held in the sanctuary of Eleusis, just northwest of Athens, the mysteries drew thousands of participants, from philosophers to farmers. Unlike most Greek religious practices, these rituals weren't exclusive to social status or gender. The only requirement, secrecy. To reveal what happened inside was punishable, sometimes by death. The rites centered on the story of Persephone, the maiden abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. Her mother, Demeter, goddess of agriculture, mourned so deeply that the earth itself withered. Their eventual reunion symbolized the return of life in spring and the hope of life after death. What does that have to do with sex? Potentially everything. The myth itself is deeply symbolic: abduction, descent, reunion, and fertility. Some scholars argue that the secret climax of the Eleusinian mysteries involved a dramatic reenactment, possibly including a ritualized union between actors playing Persephone and a divine male consort. Whether literal or purely symbolic, the experience was said to be overwhelming, emotionally, psychologically, and perhaps physically. Participants fasted, walked in torchlit processions, drank a mysterious potion called kykion, and entered the telesterion, the inner chamber where the final rites occurred. Whatever they saw in that space left them forever changed. Many described it as a moment of enlightenment, an intimate encounter with divine truth. No one ever wrote down what happened. That's how deeply the vow of silence was respected. The Eleusinian mysteries weren't about pleasure for its own sake. They were about transformation, the possibility that sensuality and divinity might meet not in opposition, but in union. In a world where death was a constant presence, Eleusis offered hope that perhaps through darkness came light, through descent, return, and through sacred union, eternal renewal. While Western rites often wrap sensuality in myth or secrecy, ancient India took a more direct and more spiritual approach. Enter Tantra, a complex, often misunderstood tradition that regarded sexual energy not as a sin but as a sacred force, a divine spark that, if harnessed properly, could lead to enlightenment. Tantra is not a single religion or doctrine. It emerged across various schools of Hinduism and Buddhism, evolving over centuries. At its core, however, is the belief that the physical and spiritual worlds are not separate. To reach the divine, one doesn't escape the body, one fully inhabits it. Some tantric sects developed intricate rituals designed to transform everyday acts, eating, breathing, even intimacy, into paths toward liberation. Among the most famous and most controversial of these were the tantric sex rites, which involved carefully structured encounters between partners. These weren't about indulgence. They were sacred ceremonies performed with meditation, breath control, and chants. Every movement had symbolic meaning. Every moment was intentional. The male represented Shiva, stillness, consciousness. The female embodied Shakti, energy, creation. Their union mirrored the merging of opposites, the eternal dance between chaos and order, spirit and matter. The goal wasn't pleasure, but transcendence, a glimpse of divinity through the lens of desire. But let's clear up a common myth. Not all Tantra involved sexual rituals. In fact, most tantric practices were deeply ascetic. Chanting, visualizations, yoga, and intense focus were central. The sexual aspect, when present, was just one doorway among many, and often shrouded in layers of symbolism that made its meaning difficult to decode. That said, some texts, like the Kama Sutra, often mistaken for a mere manual of positions, were rooted in the same worldview. Pleasure wasn't condemned. It was studied, refined, and placed within a larger spiritual system. In medieval temples such as Khajuraho and Konark, sculptures of intertwined lovers adorn the stone walls, not as decoration, but as declaration. The path to the sacred runs through the senses. To ancient tantrics, desire was not a distraction, it was fuel. And when lit with wisdom and reverence, It could burn a path straight to the heart of the universe. Before Babylon, before Egypt's golden dynasties, there was Sumer, one of the world's first civilizations. And in its bustling temple complexes, particularly in the city of Uruk, the roots of sacred sexuality were already growing. At the heart of it all was the goddess Inanna, later known as Ishtar, and her enigmatic priestesses, women whose bodies were vessels for divine power. These women were not ordinary prostitutes. They were known as hierodules, sacred servants. Their sexuality was ritualized, honored, and seen as part of the cosmic order. In Sumerian texts and hymns, Inanna is described as a passionate, sensuous deity who celebrated love, fertility, and pleasure. Her temple ceremonies reflected this ethos, the merging of the spiritual and physical into a single, holistic form of worship. One of the most fascinating rituals believed to have taken place was the sacred marriage rite. Each year, during the New Year festival, the king of the land would symbolically marry the goddess through a high priestess. The ceremony involved music, offerings, poetry, and according to many scholars, physical union. This wasn't seen as mere spectacle, it was the centerpiece of the city's renewal. By reenacting the goddess's divine union with her lover Dumuzid, the king was legitimized, the crops were blessed, and the cycle of life was renewed. Even outside this major event, sacred sexuality was part of the rhythm of temple life. The priestesses of Inanna were trained in music, dance, incantation, and the arts of love. For those who sought spiritual purification or divine favor, union with a hierodule was thought to bring healing, insight, or fertility. It was a rite, not a transaction. The role wasn't without complexity. Some of these women held powerful positions and lived within the protective walls of the temple, while others may have existed on its periphery, vulnerable to exploitation. Over time, the sacred faded, and later empires painted these practices in a less favorable light, collapsing the divine into the profane. But in ancient Sumer, the body wasn't something to repress. It was a channel through which the divine flowed, like river water across fertile earth. And in the sacred chambers of Inanna, love was more than emotion. It was ritual. Far from the temples of the Near East and the mystic rituals of India, the ancient Celts celebrated fertility with fire, freedom, and forests. Their sacred festival was called Beltane, held on the eve of May, a liminal time between spring and summer when the boundaries between the natural and supernatural blurred. It was a celebration of life, growth, and desire, and it was anything but modest. The Celts believed that the world pulsed with spiritual energy, spirits in trees, rivers, stones. And during Beltane, the energy of reproduction and rebirth reached its peak. Large bonfires were lit across hilltops, symbolizing purification and protection. People would dance around the flames, leap through the smoke for blessings, and even lead livestock between twin fires to guard them from illness in the coming season. But it was what happened after the firelight dimmed that gave Beltane its legendary reputation. Unmarried men and women would venture into the woods together for what was known as greenwood marriages. These were temporary unions, free from societal rules and often consummated under the stars. It wasn't considered scandalous, quite the opposite. These encounters were viewed as sacred acts, aligned with the fertility of the earth. To join with a partner on Beltane night was to participate in the cosmic rhythms of nature, to mirror the union of the Earth Mother and the horned god, the divine masculine and feminine. Some accounts suggest that even married couples might briefly suspend their vows for the night, not out of infidelity, but out of reverence for tradition and renewal. Children conceived during Beltane were sometimes called children of the fire, believed to be blessed with strength and vitality. It was a festival where rules softened, desire was acknowledged, and life itself was celebrated in its rawest form. There were no temples. Nature was the altar, the forest the bedchamber, the flame the witness. With the arrival of Christianity, many of these practices were condemned or suppressed, but echoes of Beltane survive in modern May Day rituals, folk dances, and quiet whispers of the old ways. By the time Christianity spread across Europe and the Near East, the sacred sexuality of the ancient world faced a quiet extinction. What had once been ritual, performed in temples, forests, and festivals, was increasingly rebranded as sin. The body, once seen as a vessel of divine energy, was recast as a source of temptation. Pleasure became something to be resisted, not revered. But the shift didn't happen overnight. In its earliest days, Christianity wasn't yet the institutional power it would become. It grew in the margins, among mystics, ascetics, and radical thinkers. Some of these early sects, like the Gnostics, held beliefs that echoed older spiritual systems. They saw the physical world, including sexuality, as a metaphor for higher truths. Some Gnostic texts even framed the union of male and female as a mirror of the divine unity between spiritual opposites, reminiscent of tantric ideas from India or the symbolic marriages of Sumer. One particularly mysterious sect, known as the Carpocratians, reportedly practiced spiritual rituals that included physical union, believing that true enlightenment required experiencing all things, including desire, without shame or fear. These fringe communities were quickly labeled heretical by the emerging church, their writings destroyed or buried. But hints remain in dusty codices, gospels excluded from the Bible, and the quiet survival of old symbols repurposed for new dogma. As orthodoxy tightened its grip, rituals of sacred sexuality were driven underground. Temples were razed or converted, festivals like Beltane were rebranded or forbidden. The sacred prostitute became a sinner, the sensual mystic became a heretic. But people, being people, remembered. In secret, in story, in symbol. Medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen wrote of divine ecstasy that sounded suspiciously physical. Visionaries described spiritual rapture using the language of union and passion. Even saints, in their moments of closest communion with God, often used metaphors that blurred the line between body and spirit. And so the sacred didn't vanish, it transformed. What began in the groves of Eleusis, in the chambers of Inanna, and in the forests of the Celts never truly died. It went underground, into poetry, into dreams, into memory. Because while temples can be destroyed and rituals forbidden, the human longing to merge the physical with the divine, that's eternal. In the shadowed corridors of ancient Athens, where reason was supposed to triumph over vengeance, poison was handed down in a cup. In 399 BCE, the philosopher Socrates, one of the most influential minds in Western thought, was sentenced to death, not by sword nor by exile, but by hemlock. It was a strange trial from the start. Socrates, a man who owned no property, wrote no books, and claimed to know nothing, was accused of corrupting the youth and introducing new gods. In truth, he had become a thorn in the side of the Athenian elite, questioning authority, mocking self-proclaimed wise men, and teaching his students to do the same. His very method, asking relentless questions, was seen not as education, but as sedition. The court offered him alternatives. He could suggest a lighter punishment, a fine, exile, anything. But Socrates, as stubborn in death as in life, refused to beg. Instead, he proposed something absurd, that he be rewarded for his service to Athens. The jury was not amused. The sentence, death by hemlock. Hemlock was no dramatic assassin's blade. It was clinical, efficient, a slow paralysis that began in the limbs and crept upward until it reached the heart. No blood, no screams, just silence. On the final day, surrounded by friends and students, Socrates was cheerful. He bathed, said goodbye to his children, and took the poison with calm resignation. As the cold numbness reached his legs, he continued to speak about the immortality of the soul, discussing death not as an end, but as a transition. His followers wept. Socrates did not. He died with his mind intact, a final lesson in control, conviction, and principle. He could have escaped. His supporters had arranged it. But he chose to obey the law, even the unjust one, believing that undermining the city's order would do more harm than his death. And so Athens rid itself of its greatest critic, not with chains or torture, but with a cup of tea brewed from a lethal root. In killing Socrates, they didn't silence him, they made him immortal. Hemlock didn't stop his voice, it amplified it through time. When you think of Cleopatra, you likely picture the seductress queen, draped in silk, whispering Latin to Julius Caesar and Greek to Mark Antony. But beyond the politics and poetry, Cleopatra was also a student of science, particularly toxicology. She wasn't just beautiful, she was dangerous in ways few suspected. As ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra had access to one of the greatest libraries of the ancient world. And within those scrolls were secrets not just of the stars and gods, but of poisons, venoms, and their effects on the body and mind. She reportedly maintained a personal laboratory and even conducted experiments on prisoners, testing various concoctions to observe which toxins killed quickly, which caused agony and which left no trace. She wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. In her world, poison was politics. It was preparation. Cleopatra didn't trust blades or battles to do the job when a drop of venom could be faster, quieter, and more precise. Assassination by poison was the scalpel in the toolkit of rulers, and Cleopatra was a surgeon. She studied nightshade, strychnine, hemlock, and aconite. She experimented with mixtures of snake venom and herbs. Some poisons caused hallucinations, others mimicked illness. Some killed within moments, others took hours, allowing time for confessions or blame to be redirected. And then, of course, there's the asp, the snake she supposedly used to end her own life. Legend says that when Octavian, later Augustus Caesar, conquered Egypt, Cleopatra refused to be paraded through Rome as a captive. Instead, she clasped and asped venom to claim her. But even this death is debated. Some historians believe she may have swallowed a fast-acting poison hidden in a hairpin or ointment. After all, Cleopatra would have known which poisons caused convulsions and which brought a graceful death. The asp may have simply been the perfect symbol, a quiet sting for a queen too proud to be caged. To Cleopatra, poison wasn't a crime, it was control. It was the art of deciding who lives, who dies, and how history would remember her. And if her enemies underestimated her because of her charm, they often never lived long enough to regret it. In the Roman Empire, power didn't just corrupt, it poisoned, literally. Behind the golden columns of the imperial palace, poison became the preferred method for eliminating rivals. No messy civil wars, no public executions, just a cup of wine, a bowl of figs, and a corpse before dessert. The emperors were no strangers to betrayal, and few trusted their own inner circles. In the 1st century CE, under the rule of Emperor Claudius, poison entered its golden age thanks to one woman, Locusta, Rome's most infamous professional poisoner. Locusta wasn't just some shadowy figure in a back alley with a vial. She was a trained expert, practically a chemist by ancient standards, who served the political ambitions of the powerful. When Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's wife, wanted her son Nero on the throne, she called on Locusta. The result, a carefully poisoned dish of mushrooms, Claudius's favorite, and a rapid decline in imperial health. But the drama didn't stop there. Once Nero became emperor, he employed Locusta like a royal assassin. When his teenage stepbrother Britannicus posed a threat to his throne, Locusta was again summoned. The young prince died mid-banquet, convulsing in front of horrified guests. Nero was so impressed he gave Locusta a full pardon, land, and even students to train in her deadly craft. In Rome, poison was the weapon of the educated, aristocratic, subtle and difficult to trace. While blades left witnesses, poison left doubt. Was it illness, indigestion, divine punishment? The paranoia it bred was enormous. Cups were tested, food was tasted, even slaves became suspect. Rome developed elaborate defenses, silver spoons to detect toxins, antidotes made of crushed emeralds, and the famous theriac, a universal antidote made from dozens of ingredients, including opium and viper flesh. Yet none of it could stop the slow tide of quiet deaths. Poison in Rome was more than a tool. It was a language, a silent negotiation between survival and ambition. And in the halls of marble and blood, it whispered louder than swords. In ancient China, poison was less a crime and more an art. Among the imperial courts of the Han, Tang, and Ming dynasties, it became a subtle language of power, used in whispers, silk sleeves, and teacups. No grand gestures, just a soft breath and then silence. The Chinese elite were masters of pharmacology. Traditional medicine blurred the lines between healing and harm. A pinch too much of an herb, and the cure became the killer. Court alchemists and palace physicians walked a tightrope, creating antidotes one day, poisons the next. But the true experts of this quiet war were often women, particularly imperial consorts and concubines. Forbidden from wielding swords or political titles, some turned to more discreet methods. A rival could be removed not through scandal, but through sickness. The Empress Dowager might never raise her voice, only her eyebrow, and days later a challenger would be coughing blood in bed. One infamous example is Empress Lu Ji of the Han Dynasty. After securing power, she systematically eliminated threats to her rule, including rivals within the harem. Her methods were grim, including poisoning and slow mutilation. She wasn't just feared, she was legendary, a ruler who used medicine not to heal the empire but to bend it, Even beyond the palace walls, poison was a feared political weapon. Assassins of secret societies like the Five Poison Sect were rumored to coat blades with toxic herbs or slip lethal tinctures into ceremonial wine. Poison wasn't just effective, it was theatrical, a statement. It said, "I can reach you even here." Because of this, China developed one of the most advanced systems of poison detection in the ancient world. Officials tested meals with silver chopsticks, believing they would tarnish in the presence of arsenic. Imperial kitchens became mini laboratories, not just for flavor, but for safety. In China, poison wasn't impulsive. It was precise, ritualistic, a chess move, not a brawl. And though rarely seen, it ruled dynasties just as surely as emperors did. In the ancient courts of India, there existed a tale so chilling it sounds like mythology, yet appears in royal texts, legends, and political treatises. These were the Vishakanyas, or poison maidens, women whose very bodies were said to be lethal, not because they carried daggers, but because they were the dagger. The legend says that certain young girls, chosen at a very early age, were slowly fed minute doses of poison day after day, drop by drop. Their bodies would build immunity, but in turn, their blood, sweat, and even breath became toxic to others, especially lovers. A kiss from a Vishakanya, it was said, could mean death. Intimacy wasn't passion, it was execution. This practice allegedly began under Chanakya, the cunning strategist and royal advisor to Chandragupta Maurya around the 4th century BCE. Chanakya was a firm believer in espionage and psychological warfare. According to the Arthashastra, an ancient political manual attributed to him, poison was not just a tool of war, it was a tool of statecraft. Enemies could be seduced and slain without raising a single sword. Were the Vishakanyas real? That's still debated. Some scholars think they were metaphorical symbols of seductive danger or cautionary tales against courtly temptation. Others argue there may have been real attempts to create such assassins through gradual poisoning, a practice known in Ayurveda and ancient medicine as Vishakrama. Even if they were legend, the fear they invoked was real. Foreign dignitaries were warned, meals were tested, and any beautiful stranger arriving at court might be seen not as a gift, but a threat in silk. Poison in India wasn't always hidden in goblets. Sometimes it wore jewelry, smiled sweetly, and danced in royal courts. And this idea that beauty could kill fed centuries of intrigue, suspicion, and countermeasures. What made the Vishakanya myth so terrifying wasn't just the poison, it was the intimacy of the danger. Death didn't ride into battle, it leaned in close and whispered. If ever a king saw threats in every shadow, it was Herod the Great, ruler of Judea under Roman authority in the 1st century BCE, a man of grand architecture, brutal politics, and deep insecurities. Herod didn't trust swords alone to keep him on the throne. In his court, poison was paranoia made liquid. Herod's reign was infamous for its violence, but not all of his executions were public spectacles. Some were private, very private. As his power grew, so did his fear of rivals, of Roman suspicion, and most tragically of his own family. His wife, Mariamne, a Hasmonean princess of noble blood, was once the love of his life, but Herod became convinced, wrongly, that she plotted against him. She was executed. So were her mother, her grandfather, and eventually his own sons. According to Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, Herod had Mariamne's sons poisoned in secret, under the guise of Roman justice. They were popular, legitimate heirs with royal Jewish blood, and that made them dangerous. Herod couldn't allow any future coup to have a noble figurehead. The poisonings didn't stop there. Herod used informants, interrogators, and yes, poisons to quietly eliminate anyone who even appeared disloyal: ministers, servants, relatives. Some were drugged to induce confessions, others were simply removed with no explanation, their illnesses blamed on divine wrath or bad air. Poison allowed Herod to rule with surgical cruelty. It didn't stir public unrest like crucifixions or beheadings. It was clean, it was discreet, and it sent a message. No one was untouchable, not even those who shared his bloodline. Herod's obsession with poison extended beyond assassination. In his final days, racked with disease and madness, he feared his own death would go unmourned. He ordered that prominent Jewish leaders be gathered and executed upon his death to ensure there would be national grief. Thankfully, that order was never carried out, but the paranoia that filled his court had long poisoned his legacy. In the grand halls of Persepolis, amidst golden columns and carved reliefs of warriors and lions, another battle was unfolding, one not of armies but of whispers and goblets. In the Achaemenid Empire, where kings ruled continents, poison became a tool of refinement, elegant, deadly, and often invisible. The Persian court under kings like Darius the Great and Xerxes was a place of opulence and ceremony, but it was also a hive of political maneuvering, palace rivalries, and dynastic ambition. With dozens of wives, concubines, sons, satraps, and generals all vying for influence, poison was the quiet equalizer. Historical records from Greek sources, especially the ever-dramatic Herodotus, tell of assassination plots cloaked in luxury. Food tasters were standard practice, and kitchens were locked down like military zones. The mere suspicion of poisoning was enough to see a cook or cupbearer executed on the spot. One infamous figure was Bagoas, a Persian eunuch and court official who rose to immense power under Artaxerxes III in the 4th century BCE. According to accounts, Bagoas poisoned not just his enemies, but the king himself, and then installed a puppet monarch, only to poison him too when he proved difficult. Bagoas controlled the court not through armies, but through apothecary jars. Persian knowledge of herbal medicine was advanced, and so was their understanding of toxins. From aconite to arsenic, they experimented with subtle agents, slow-acting substances that mimicked natural illness or fast ones that struck like lightning. Poison wasn't just a method of execution, it was an art form of discretion. Because in Persia, power was built on appearances. To kill publicly was to risk scandal. But poison? Poison let the empire breathe easily, while its enemies died quietly in their beds. A noble would go to sleep feeling victorious and never wake. Even Alexander the Great's death, which occurred shortly after conquering Persia, was rumored to be from a poison derived from Eastern knowledge, slipped into his wine during a banquet in Babylon. Whether true or not, the suspicion reveals the reputation Persians held for invisible warfare. In the Achaemenid Empire, kings reigned through image, wealth, and order. Though less theatrical than the palaces of Rome or the harems of Persia, ancient Israel and its surrounding cultures did not exist outside the reach of poison. In fact, the Bible contains several curious references to deadly herbs, tainted drinks, and divine tests involving toxic brews, suggesting that poison was known, feared, and sometimes used as proof of guilt or innocence. One of the strangest examples comes from the Book of Numbers, where a ritual called the ordeal of bitter water is described. If a man suspected his wife of adultery, he could take her to a priest, who would mix holy water with dust from the temple floor and force her to drink it. The idea was simple. If she was guilty, the cursed drink would swell her belly and curse her womb. If she was innocent, nothing would happen. This wasn't just divine intervention, it was an early form of trial by poison, a dangerous liquid used not to kill outright, but to provoke a reaction and extract truth. Elsewhere in Scripture, poison appears more metaphorically, but still with dark weight. In Deuteronomy, the land of Israel is warned against worshiping false gods with threats that the people's food and water would be cursed. Gall and wormwood, both known in antiquity for their bitterness and toxicity. In Job, poison is compared to injustice, and in the Psalms, the wicked are said to have poison under their tongues, a symbol of deception and deadly intent. There's also Herod, who appears in the New Testament and whose reputation for poison we covered earlier, linking biblical history with the greater story of toxic politics in the ancient world. While we don't see dramatic assassinations by poison in the core biblical texts, the awareness of its power was certainly there. The Hebrews lived among empires where poison was a courtly art, and they adapted their own legal and spiritual interpretations to fit that dangerous reality. Across the empires of antiquity, from the halls of Athens to the sands of Egypt, from the palaces of Rome to the forests of India, one weapon remained universal: elegant and terrifying poison. It required no army, it left no battlefield. It killed without noise, without witnesses, and often without blame. In an age where brute force ruled the public square, poison was the preferred tool of the private war. The conflicts fought behind curtains, in bedrooms, banquet halls, and temples. It was a political equalizer, a whisper of death where a shout might bring chaos. But poison was more than a method, it was a message. In ancient times, to die by the sword was honorable. It meant you were a threat worth confronting openly. To die by poison, however, was something else entirely. It meant someone close to you, someone trusted, had made a choice. Poison always involved betrayal. A servant, a spouse, a cupbearer, a family member. It turned every bite into a gamble, every goblet into a test of loyalty. The ancient world respected poison's subtlety. Philosophers saw it as a symbol of fate, of punishment, of power disguised as grace. Religions invoked it as divine judgment, and rulers used it to maintain the illusion of peace while quietly rewriting their bloodlines. What makes poison so enduring is its paradox. It is at once cowardly and clever, invisible yet unforgettable. It doesn't just kill the body, it erodes trust, leaves suspicion, and casts long shadows on legacies. Even today, its mythology lingers. The hemlock of Socrates, Cleopatra's asp, the poisoned figs of Claudius, the Vishakanyas of India. These are more than deaths. They are parables, reminders that in the theater of power, the deadliest actors are often those who never take the stage. Poison has no face, no voice, no armor, but in ancient history it shaped dynasties, rewrote successions, and whispered through every corridor of power. It was, and still is, the perfect assassin. It all began with wood, dust, and ingenuity. Along the banks of the Nile in ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, priests, and precision, protecting one's possessions was more than practical, it was symbolic. Whether it was grain stored for famine, papyrus scrolls hidden in temple chambers, or treasures entombed with a pharaoh, access had to be controlled. And for that, they invented something revolutionary, the pin tumbler lock. Dating back as early as 2000 BCE, these were the world's first known mechanical locks, carved entirely from wood. The device was rudimentary by modern standards, but conceptually brilliant. The lock consisted of a horizontal bolt that slid into a frame to secure a door. The bolt had holes drilled into it, and when it was pushed into place, a set of vertical pins dropped down into those holes from above, locking it shut. To unlock it, you needed a key, but not just any key. This early Egyptian key was a large wooden instrument, often resembling a toothbrush with pegs. When inserted into the lock top, the key lifted the pins out of the bolt holes, allowing the bolt to slide open. No brute force, no chisel, just design and gravity. This was more than just a gadget, it was a philosophy of protection. For the Egyptians, who believed in order, ma'at, over chaos, it fed the idea of regulating access, of closing a chamber, of choosing who enters and who does not. It carried deep meaning. Locks were used in homes, temples, and tombs. Pharaohs were buried with sealed chambers, sometimes with locked doors and false passages. Security wasn't just about possessions, it was about eternity. What's astonishing is how familiar this technology feels. The basic pin and key concept behind the wooden Egyptian lock still exists in modern metal locks today. Pins dropping into holes, keys lifting them into alignment. It's a 4,000-year-old idea, unchanged in principle. Though the wooden mechanisms eventually decayed and few original keys survived, the design was so effective it spread. It whispered its way from Egypt to the Greeks, then to the Romans, and eventually the rest of the world. Before tumblers clicked and bolts slid into place, there were seals, the silent sentinels of ancient Mesopotamia. In the cities of Babylon and Nineveh, locks as we know them weren't yet common. But the people of Mesopotamia had already developed a remarkably effective way to secure, authenticate, and restrict access. Their solution wasn't mechanical, it was symbolic. Enter the cylinder seal. These small, intricately carved cylinders were worn around the neck or wrist like a ring or pendant. Each seal was unique, a personal signature often etched with mythological scenes, animals, gods, or even cuneiform inscriptions. To use it, a person would roll the cylinder across a soft surface of wet clay, leaving behind a long impression, a kind of ancient barcode. Seals were used to close jars, secure doorways, and protect caskets. If someone tried to break in, the clay seal would crack, making tampering obvious. More than that, the impression itself verified who had closed the container or room. You didn't need a key to open it, you needed a reason to break the seal. It was primitive, yes, but also incredibly effective in a society where reputation and official marks carried enormous weight. In temples, priests sealed sacred storerooms with their personal sigils, merchants sealed contracts. Even kings used seals to lock away correspondence. Entire economies operated under the authority of this little carved token. Security in Mesopotamia wasn't about denial of access through force, but about proof of legitimacy. If the seal was intact, the contents were safe. If it was broken, something was wrong. The seal system also introduced another radical concept: identity as security. The seal wasn't just a tool, it was a mark of trust, authority, and often legal power. Lose your seal, and you didn't just misplace a tool, you lost your name. It's no exaggeration to say that these cylinder seals were the earliest form of two-factor authentication. Not a password, not a PIN, but a physical artifact that said, "This is mine, and only I have the right to open it." While the Mesopotamians relied on seals and the Egyptians mastered wooden pin locks, the ancient Greeks brought a new kind of craftsmanship to personal security. With their growing cities, private homes, temples, and treasuries, the Greeks began to develop more compact, durable, and practical locking mechanisms. And with them came the rise of the locksmith, a specialized trade in the ancient world. Greek locks were a step forward from Egypt's bulky wooden designs. They often used metal components, though many parts were still fashioned from wood due to resource constraints and cost. The most common form was the bolt lock, where a sliding bar fit into a catch or groove in the door frame. It was secured in place with a metal pin or peg and could only be released using a specially shaped key, often made of bronze or iron. But Greek keys weren't the small pocket versions we know today. These were long, L-shaped rods, sometimes nearly as long as a human forearm. To unlock the door, the key was inserted into a vertical keyhole and used to lift and manipulate internal pins or pegs, allowing the bolt to slide free. The motion was both physical and symbolic. To carry a key was to carry authority, and to use it was to assert control over a space. Temples used locks to secure votive offerings. Wealthy citizens locked chests filled with coinage or jewelry. Even public buildings had secured archives and storerooms. The technology wasn't widespread. Most common homes relied on wooden latches or simple bars. But in the world of aristocrats, scholars, and priests, the lock became an object of both function and status. What set the Greeks apart was not just the mechanics, but the philosophy behind their locks. Security in Athens, especially, was tied to property rights and citizenship. A locked door meant privacy, ownership, autonomy, and the locksmith was no longer a mere artisan. He was a technician of trust. In an era defined by public debate and private drama, the Greek lock was the silent partner, keeping secrets safe behind oak doors and stone vaults. If the Greeks laid the groundwork, the Romans refined it. By the height of the Roman Empire, locks were no longer experimental. They were everywhere, in homes, in temples, in shops, and on the wrists of slaves. The Romans brought structure to everything they touched. Roads, laws, armies, and security was no exception. Roman locks became smaller, stronger, and smarter. They used metal components, primarily bronze and iron, which meant these locks lasted longer and were harder to tamper with. The most common type was the warded lock, a system where only a key with the correct notches could rotate within the lock to move the bolt. The wards were fixed internal obstacles, and if your key didn't have the right cuts, it simply wouldn't turn. This led to the invention of the skeleton key, a stripped-down key that could bypass the wards in simpler locks. Romans loved this trick, so did thieves. But the real marvel was the Roman puzzle lock, small, intricately crafted mechanisms often built into boxes or chests. These locks required not just the right key, but sometimes a sequence of movements or pressure points to unlock. Some even used false keyholes to throw off would-be intruders. These were the ancient world's version of a combination safe. Roman keys themselves were often small and elegant, sometimes worn as rings, a convenient blend of utility and jewelry. It was common for Roman citizens to wear their keys on their fingers as a status symbol. If you had a key, it meant you owned something worth locking up. Interestingly, some locks were also placed on slave collars, marked with inscriptions like, "If found, return to master." These locks weren't protecting treasure, they were enforcing ownership. Chilling, but a reminder that security in Rome wasn't always about valuables, it was also about power. The Roman Empire's approach to locks wasn't just practical, it was personal. Keys were made to fit your lock and no one else's. They protected not just gold, but letters, heirlooms, recipes, and sometimes secrets. While the West refined its keys and bolts, the East was quietly crafting elegant mechanical marvels of its own. In ancient China, lock-making wasn't just a matter of utility. It was a reflection of balance, precision, and sometimes even spiritual harmony. By the Zhou dynasty around 100 BCE, Chinese artisans were producing all-metal locks, often made from bronze and later iron. These were compact, portable, and mechanically sophisticated. Unlike the large, visible systems used in Egypt or Greece, Chinese locks were designed to be discreet and efficient, often built into chests, cabinets, and even gates. The most iconic form was the Chinese padlock, or suo. These were usually barrel-shaped or rectangular, with a flat key inserted from one end. Inside, a series of spring-loaded tumblers or pins would align when the right key was inserted, allowing the bolt to slide free. Sound familiar? It should. The pin tumbler design mirrored the same logic the Egyptians had pioneered centuries earlier, but the Chinese took it further by miniaturizing it and improving durability. Some locks were shaped like animals or mythical creatures, dragons, tigers, turtles, combining practical use with symbolic protection. A tiger-shaped lock on your chest wasn't just security, it was spiritual defense. The design conveyed power, guardianship, and often luck. China also developed trick locks, early versions of puzzle locks that required multiple steps or deceptive angles to open. These weren't just used to guard money or jewelry. Scholars and officials stored important documents, calligraphy, or family heirlooms in locked boxes that could only be opened by someone who understood the mechanism. Security was about intellect, not just ownership. Locksmithing became a respected trade. Some artisans kept their techniques secret, passing them down through families. Others innovated new forms that traveled along the Silk Road, influencing security systems as far as the Middle East. In the heart of ancient India, amidst temples, scrolls, and intricate palace corridors, security was treated not merely as protection, but as art, ritual, and sometimes even spiritual safeguard. Though India's ancient locks haven't survived in as large numbers as Roman or Chinese counterparts, references in Sanskrit texts and archaeological finds suggest that by the time of the Maurya Empire, around 300 BCE, mechanical locks were not only in use, they were evolving in clever and culturally distinct ways. Indian locks were often used to secure temples, treasure rooms, and storage chests, many of which contained not just wealth but sacred relics or royal documentation. These locks were primarily metal, small in size, and employed internal levers or pin systems, some using sliding tumblers similar to Chinese and Roman designs. But ancient Indian ingenuity took a special turn toward camouflage security. Carved wooden panels in temples and royal palaces would sometimes conceal hidden compartments or false drawers, protected by secret trigger locks that only a select few knew how to operate. A push in the right spot, a twist of a carved leaf, and a panel would spring open or shut. Some of these mechanisms still baffle modern restorers, built with such precision and mystery that they border on architectural riddles. Sanskrit texts like the Arthashastra, a political and economic treatise from the Maurya era, detail the importance of guarding information, treasure, and royal property, using secret rooms, double doors, and disguised locks. These weren't just mechanical, they were psychological. The idea was not only to keep intruders out, but to prevent them from even realizing something needed protecting. Locks in India were also deeply symbolic. A temple gate might be locked not just for security, but as part of a ritual cycle, opened only on auspicious days. Certain lock designs incorporated lotus flowers, serpents, or sacred geometry, acting as both deterrent and blessing. In Indian philosophy, protection wasn't always about confrontation. It was about redirection, illusion, and wisdom. In the misty forests and icy fjords of ancient northern Europe, locks weren't simply tools of convenience. They were statements of territory, symbols of ownership, and at times charms against the unknown. Among the Celts, whose societies flourished across Iron Age Britain and Gaul, security was more practical than ornamental. Their homes and granaries often relied on heavy wooden bars, iron door rings, and sliding bolts. Yet archaeological digs at Celtic sites have unearthed padlocks and keys, often simple in design but made with surprising precision, early evidence of iron-forged warded locks, much like those used in the Roman world. It's likely that these technologies spread through contact with Roman traders or occupying forces. But for the Celts, protection wasn't always mechanical, it was spiritual. Homes were guarded with charms, symbols, and ritual markings on thresholds to ward off not just thieves but spirits. A locked door may have kept out raiders, but a carved triskele or hanging amulet was meant to keep out mischievous fairies or vengeful ghosts. In their worldview, security wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. The Norse too took locks seriously, especially when it came to storage and seafaring. Viking ships and chests were often equipped with iron padlocks designed to withstand weather, theft, and sabotage. Some Norse keys were found with burial goods, shaped like serpents, axes, or even miniature Thor's hammers. These were both functional tools and symbols of authority. To carry a key was to own, command, and protect. Women in Viking society often held the keys to the household, quite literally. Archaeological finds show women buried with elaborate key rings and belt-hung lockpicks. In a way, the key wasn't just about entry, it was status, trust, and identity. Interestingly, Norse mythology itself touches on locking and unlocking. The gods used runes to seal doors, and certain spells were designed to bind or unbind fate, echoing the symbolic power of locks beyond the physical world. So while the North may not have had the ornate puzzle locks of Rome or the philosophical elegance of China, their locks told their own story, one forged in iron, tradition, and superstition. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the Byzantine Empire rose in the east, carrying forward Roman engineering and its love for locks. But Byzantium didn't just preserve ancient designs, it refined them, combining Roman mechanics with Eastern elegance while passing on security technology into the Islamic Golden Age. Byzantine locks were often miniature masterpieces. Their padlocks, shaped like animals, crosses, or abstract patterns, were made from bronze or iron and used advanced ward systems that required precisely cut keys. Many Byzantine locks incorporated rotating bolts, spring-loaded mechanisms, and false keyholes, laying the groundwork for modern puzzle locks. The tradition of wearing keys as badges of status continued. Bishops and abbots often carried ceremonial keys to churches and archives, emphasizing access as sacred privilege. But it was in the Islamic caliphates, especially during the Abbasid era, that the science of security blossomed into both art and innovation. Building on knowledge from Persia, India, Greece, and Rome, Islamic craftsmen elevated lockmaking to a highly respected trade. The Abbasids, ruling from Baghdad, developed extremely sophisticated lock systems, some with 4 or 5 internal levers, intricate tumblers, and even early combination mechanisms. Their padlocks were both beautiful and cunning. Brass locks shaped like lions, fish, or birds were not only functional, they were statements. Arabic inscriptions often adorned the sides, praising Allah or stating the owner's name, fusing faith, identity, and security. Islamic scholars also wrote treatises on mechanical devices. Al-Jazari, the 12th century Muslim inventor, famously documented dozens of mechanisms, including water clocks and automatic locks, some of which involved complex gears and hidden triggers. He is often regarded as one of the earliest mechanical engineers in history, and many of his principles still inform lockmaking today. Meanwhile, Islamic markets and palaces relied on these evolving locks to secure everything from treasure chests and religious relics to library doors and merchant stalls. In a time when science and theology walked hand in hand, a well-made lock wasn't just protection, it was a reflection of divine order and human mastery. By the end of antiquity, locks had evolved far beyond bolts and bars. They had become symbols of civilization itself, tools that reflected a society's values, fears, and ambitions. Whether forged in iron, carved in wood, or hidden behind sacred geometry, ancient locks weren't just about keeping things out. They were about deciding who got to come in. From the wooden pin tumblers of Egypt to the mechanical puzzles of Byzantium, every culture added a layer to the story. Each key held power, not just practical, but psychological. To possess a key was to hold authority, access, and often secrecy. Locks told you who ruled the house, who controlled the grain, who had the right to touch the scroll, open the shrine, or enter the tomb. And as technology advanced, so did the theatrics of protection. False keyholes, hidden compartments, locks shaped like lions or wrapped in inscriptions. These weren't just defenses, they were messages. They said, I am valuable, I am protected, I know something you don't. Even more fascinating is how locks were shaped by and in turn shaped human behavior. In cultures that valued hierarchy, locks reinforced boundaries. In societies with fluid trade and diverse populations, they protected marketplaces, homes, and temples from mistrust and theft. In religious systems, they safeguarded the sacred, not just from humans, but from the impure, the unworthy, the uninitiated. And then there's the paradox. The more advanced locks became, the more lockpickers followed. Just as every civilization developed better security, others learned how to bypass it. The cat and mouse game we know today, it started thousands of years ago in a Mesopotamian grain vault or a Roman merchant's chest. Ultimately, ancient locks offer more than a glimpse into engineering. They give us insight into the human condition, our desire for safety, our tendency towards suspicion, our need to draw lines between public and private, and our relentless drive to protect what we value. Because even in the ancient world, a locked door wasn't just a barrier. It was a declaration, a quiet, enduring whisper that said, "This matters, this is mine, and only I may open it."